Good afternoon, everybody.
Good afternoon.
I'm really sorry for the late kind of notice on Canvas. I really thought I would be able to make it to work, but then, I had so much of body ache. I said, okay, let me put up the announcement and see. Hopefully, all of you saw the email. And I think our secretary admin has also posted a notice on the in the classrooms. So hopefully anybody seeing that should join the Zoom. Okay, so we'll try and do finish off the respiratory system today. And then Wednesday is your exam. So I'll definitely have a review session before the exam as well. We can decide on the time. Um, and then yeah, and we'll do the lab today on urinary system. We will start it, but of course you won't be able to see the models. So next Monday we will you'll get a chance in the lab to see the model. So we may have to sort of push the lab exam a week later because today you will only see pictures and so uh, let's see. During the lab, I'll tell you about that. Okay, so it's almost 12:46. I hope if you do have any of your friends whose phone numbers you do know, just text them and let them know that today's class is on Zoom, uh, in case they haven't seen the announcement. Okay, so I want to start off with whatever is left of the respiratory system, and these are areas which are the physiology is a little requires a little bit of understanding. Okay, so let me go ahead and the meeting is being recorded. So whoever is not here, or if you want to go over it again, you can definitely do that. And this part of the respiratory system, I have also, um, recorded it on studio. So there is a audio recording of this available to you as well. Okay, so let me go ahead, share the screen, and we will continue from there. So this is where we stopped. We were talking about gas exchange, and this is the final slide that we stopped with last week. So I told you that you should know some of these values. Okay, I not able to see this. Okay, okay, you should be able to see. You should know these values. Okay, so let's. Okay. Okay, so are you all able to see the whiteboard now or not?
Yeah.
Okay, you're able to see the whiteboard. That's wonderful. So let me do this. Okay, so let's look at atmospheric air. Okay. Atmospheric air, the partial pressure of gases in the atmosphere. The total is 760. Okay, so remember that. Don't forget. And out of this, the partial pressure of nitrogen in the atmospheric air is about 600 millimeters of mercury. The partial pressure of oxygen is 160 millimeters of mercury. Okay, this is in the atmosphere, the air that you're breathing. The partial pressure of carbon dioxide is almost zero, very, very small. Now, what about when you breathe in the air? When you breathe in air, the air that you breathe in mixes with the residual volume, the air that is already there in the lungs. And so the partial pressures will change. Okay. So the partial pressure of oxygen. Okay. Now we're talking about alveolar air. We're talking about alveolar air, that is the air in the alveolus. The partial pressure of oxygen from 160, when it mixes with the air that is already in the alveolus, the partial pressure of oxygen drops to 104 millimeters of mercury. From 160, it drops to 104 because there is now more carbon dioxide in the alveolar air. Okay, because you're constantly breathing out. So the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the alveolar air is 40 millimeters of mercury. So this is alveolar air. And 760 minus 144, the 500 something will be the partial pressure of nitrogen. So nitrogen is still there. You're breathing it in. But nitrogen doesn't diffuse into the blood. So alveolar air partial pressures are these. Okay. Now we come to the blood that is entering the alveolus from your right ventricle pumps the blood through the pulmonary artery and it enters the two lungs. So the pulmonary artery partial pressures. So remember, this is deoxygenated blood coming from your tissues. So the partial pressure of the gases, partial pressure of oxygen in the arterial blood is only about 40 millimeters of mercury, and the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is about 45 millimeters of mercury. So this is the deoxygenated blood that is coming to the lungs to get oxygenated. Okay, so the oxygen levels are pretty low, carbon dioxide levels are high because your tissues have taken up the oxygen and they have given out the carbon dioxide. So when this blood flows through the alveolus, so if we go back to page 2, the partial pressure of oxygen is 104 in the alveolus versus the blood, which is only 40. So the difference is about 64 millimeters of mercury. Okay. And for carbon dioxide, the partial pressure in the alveolar air is 40 versus 45 millimeters in the blood. So there is a difference of 5 millimeters of mercury for carbon dioxide. And you can see gases will diffuse from a region of high pressure to a region of low pressure. So from alveolar air, oxygen will diffuse in because the partial pressure of oxygen is high in the alveolar air. Whereas for carbon dioxide, the partial pressure is higher in the blood. So carbon dioxide will diffuse out of the blood. Okay. So which is what you're going to see. So after this, after the diffusion of the gases, which is simple diffusion, okay, simply because it diffuses from a region of high partial pressure to a region of low partial pressure. That's it. Because of this, when you look at the pulmonary veins, which are going to leave the lungs after oxygenation is done, if you look at the pulmonary veins, which are going to carry the oxygenated blood back to the heart, the PO2 will equilibrate with the alveolar air. So the PO2 will become 104 millimeters of mercury and the PCO2 will equilibrate to 40 millimeters of mercury. Okay. So simple diffusion of gases, and this diffusion um, does not require a very long time. It diffuses very, very quickly. Okay, so let me see what's happening here. So let me go back to, yes, continue. So now let's go back to our PowerPoint slides. There you go. Okay, so this is what I told you. So here you have, it shows you the partial pressure of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the blood that is coming from your tissues. So this is nothing but pulmonary artery blood. Okay, this is pulmonary artery. And right here is the alveolar air. And as blood leaves the capillary, the pulmonary vein, this is your pulmonary venous blood, which is the oxygenated blood, it has come to an equilibrium with the alveolar air. Now, all of this, the diffusion takes place very quickly, okay, because this is simple diffusion. So oxygen moves, as you can see the arrow here, oxygen moves from the alveolus into the blood, carbon dioxide moves out. The diffusion takes place very, very quickly. So it is actually calculated. So if you take a single red blood cell, as it moves from one end of the pulmonary capillary to the other end, it may take about 3 seconds for the blood to travel from one end of a capillary to the other end of the capillary in a single alveolus. And gas exchange finishes in about the first second itself. Gas exchange is done. Okay, oxygen is almost 104, carbon dioxide is 40 in the venous blood. So if you just were to put it in a timeline, gas exchange occurs within the first 1 second of the blood entering the capillary. Okay, although it takes about 3 seconds for the blood to travel from one end to the other, the exchange takes place very, very quickly. And it's important for you to remember this pulmonary artery values and the pulmonary venous values. These two you must remember. Why? Because this pulmonary venous value is what we always, if a person is admitted into the ICU, we are looking at arterial blood gases. Arterial blood gas, or what we call as ABG. This value is always looked at, okay, because we don't want the carbon dioxide to be any higher than 45 millimeters of mercury, and we don't want the oxygen to drop any lower than 70 millimeters of mercury. Okay, so CO2 should not become in the arterial blood, that is in the pulmonary venous blood. So you can take this value from the brachial artery, radial artery, femoral artery, it doesn't matter, carotid artery. You can take a sample to check, but the oxygen should never drop to less than 70. Carbon dioxide should never go above 45. Once a nurse sees those values, then you know that there is something wrong with gas exchange. Okay, gas exchange is not occurring properly. Oxygen is very low, so the tissues are not getting enough oxygen, and the carbon dioxide is not getting removed. Okay, so this value is really important. So pay attention to this. So when you go on to your programs, you will be learning about how arterial blood gases are measured. At that point, nobody is going to be talking about how gases diffuse and what is the partial pressure and all that. So it's good for you to understand this really well. Now, why is gas exchange so quick and so easy? The reason is, okay, let's get rid of this. The reason for that is gas exchange occurs really quickly because the surface area is really large. Okay. Of course, the partial pressure difference is there. And then the fact that the surface area is really large. Okay. Oxygen and carbon dioxide are lipid soluble, so they can easily go through the membrane, cell membrane. And blood flow and the air are perfectly matched. In a normal person, if an alveolus receives air, if it's open and air enters the alveolus, blood flow is also there through the pulmonary capillary. So there is a perfect matching of blood flow and airflow so that gas exchange occurs very, very quickly. And you know that the distance that the gas has to pass is very, very minimal because you just have one layer of simple squamous epithelium lining the alveolus. You have another layer of simple squamous epithelium lining the pulmonary capillary, which is the endothelium. And then in between the two, you have a fused basement membrane. There is no thick connective tissue. So gases can go through very, very quickly. Now comes the fact, if you're thinking, why is oxygen and carbon dioxide diffusing through the membrane? But what about nitrogen? Why is nitrogen not getting into our body? The reason for this is explained by the third gas law. Okay, there's a third gas law which explains this. Okay, let's look at that one. This is crazy. The third gas law. So we learned about Boyle's law, which explains inspiration and expiration. We learned about the Dalton's law, which explains partial pressure. Every gas in a mixture of gases exerts its own pressure, which is called the partial pressure of the gas. The third law is what is called Henry's law. The Henry's law explains how a gas diffuses in a liquid. So if you have a glass of water, like I have a glass of water next to me, there is oxygen, nitrogen, everything is dissolved in this. Okay. So what what is the law that explains the solubility of the gas in a liquid? So that is the Henry's law. So according to the Henry's law, the solubility, the amount of gas that diffuses in a liquid or dissolves in a liquid is directly related to the partial pressure of the gas and also how soluble it is in the liquid. Okay, how soluble the gas is in a liquid. So when you compare oxygen, carbon dioxide, and nitrogen, nitrogen, although the partial pressure of nitrogen is really high, that is about 600 millimeters of mercury, it still has very little solubility. Sorry. Its solubility is very, very low. As you can see, the solubility is very, very low. Very low. So that's why, even though you breathe in nitrogen, it does not diffuse. Although the partial pressure is high, even if some of it diffuses, it cannot dissolve in the water of plasma. So that's why we breathe in nitrogen and we breathe out nitrogen. That's it. So nitrogen has very little solubility. Oxygen has a reasonably high solubility in water, much more than nitrogen. So that is why it is able to go through the membrane and dissolve in the water of plasma. So oxygen can dissolve. So this glass of water will have oxygen dissolved in it because oxygen is soluble in water. But when you look at compare oxygen and carbon dioxide has a much more higher solubility in water. So 20 times greater than oxygen. So carbon dioxide will dissolve very easily in water. Okay. And that is one of the reasons why carbon dioxide is the gas that is preferred to, to pump into any liquid. Okay. Now you're all, I know many of us, I mean, me included, we are sometimes fond of these carbonated drinks. We all like Pepsi and Coke and things like that. Now, why Pepsi and Coke, if you know, they are always referred to as carbonated drinks. We call them carbonated drinks. And it's not good for health. Why is it carbonated? Because carbon dioxide is pumped into the liquid, pumped into the Coke or the Pepsi before it is bottled or canned. Okay, they pump extra carbon dioxide into the uh, liquid, into that beverage. That's why if your bottle of Coke or can of Coke has shaken a little bit, okay, and when you open it, what is it you notice? You notice the fizz, bubbles of air coming out. What is that bubbles of air? It is carbon dioxide. Again, partial pressure. Think of it. You have pumped carbon dioxide into that bottle of Coke or the can of Coke. So it is under a high pressure. Okay, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is high because it's sealed up. So when you open it, the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the drink is higher. The partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the air outside is very, very low, almost 0%. So carbon dioxide escapes out. Okay, it diffuses out of that liquid into the atmosphere. And that is what gives those bubbles, the fizz that you see. It might sometimes even overflow. The liquid might overflow because the carbon dioxide is trying to escape out. Okay, so that is what the Henry's law, when you drink a can of Coke next time and you feel that if you see the fizz, think about carbon dioxide because they have pumped carbon dioxide into it. Okay. And when we look at transport of gases, we are going to see how carbon dioxide is actually an acid. Okay. When it combines with water, it becomes an acid. And that is the reason why if you drink too much of this carbonated drink, the acid can destroy the enamel of your teeth. Okay, and that's why we say it's not good for health because you're practically drinking acid when you're drinking uh, Pepsi or Coke. There's nothing but sugar and water and acid in it. Okay, because of the carbon dioxide. So this is something that now you know. Even though you're breathing in nitrogen, nitrogen cannot enter into your blood because it does not dissolve in a liquid. Very, very low solubility. Okay? So if you want to make nitrogen dissolve in liquid, you have to increase the pressure of nitrogen. 767 600 is not enough. You have to increase it to 1200 or 3400. You have to increase the pressure if you want nitrogen to dissolve in a liquid. Okay, so I hope this is clear to you because it has a practical implication in your day-to-day life. When you are reaching out for a Coke or a Pepsi, think about this. They have pumped carbon dioxide into it. So that's why you're getting that tangy taste. The carbonated taste is because of that. Okay. So now that you know about diffusion, we are now going to look at transport. Okay. Oh, come on. We're now going to look at transport, the next one. Okay. So a summary of this. I have left out hyperbaric oxygen. This is out of interest. So I'm sure many of you have heard when oxygen is given under a higher than normal partial pressure. That means partial pressure of oxygen in the atmospheric air is about 160 millimeters of mercury. If you were to give oxygen at higher pressures, like 280 or 320 or higher partial pressures, then you call it hyperbaric oxygen, which is only used for certain diseases. Okay, we use it for um, people who have severe injuries or have had severe blood loss, or people who have, those who dive, those who have deep decompression sickness or the bends, okay, especially when they are coming up from a deep dive. If they come up very quickly, then they may have this condition called bends, and that's when we give them oxygen under a high pressure. Okay, so if any of you are interested, you can just ask me about this. This is um, um, outside of your learning part, what you need to know for the exam. I'm not going to ask you any questions on hyperbaric oxygen. Okay, so here is a summary of what gas diffusion is all about. So right at the top of the page, you can see the lung alveoli. Oxygen diffuses into the blood, carbon dioxide diffuses out. So the partial pressure, and the partial pressures are also given here. So you can see that the partial pressure of oxygen in the oxygenated blood is about 100 millimeters of mercury. So you don't have to have it exact as 104 to get an average value. It's easier to remember. So partial pressure of oxygen in the oxygenated blood is 100, and partial pressure of carbon dioxide is 40 millimeters of mercury. So this arterial blood, it reaches your left atrium, then your left ventricle. The left ventricle pumps it through the aorta to all the organs. So when the oxygenated blood reaches the organs, the cells, oxygen diffuses from the blood into the tissues, because the partial pressure of oxygen in the tissue is constantly using oxygen. So the partial pressure of oxygen in the tissues is 40, and the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is 45. So as blood reaches the tissues, oxygen diffuses in, because in the blood the partial pressure of oxygen is 100, and inside the cells it is 40. So oxygen diffuses from the blood into the tissues, and carbon dioxide, which is about 45 in the tissues and 40 in the blood, carbon dioxide diffuses out of the tissues into the blood. Okay, so by the time the exchange of gases has occurred at the level of the tissues, the partial pressure of oxygen in the deoxygenated blood is now 40 millimeters of mercury, and the carbon dioxide is 45. So this is the blood that is going to go through the heart and through the pulmonary artery into the lungs. So this is the deoxygenated blood values that we were talking about. Okay, so remember, oxygenated blood, okay, the partial pressure in the oxygenated blood and the partial pressure in the deoxygenated blood. So this is in equilibrium with the tissues. Okay, this is the tissue, and this is in equilibrium with the alveolar air. So this is a summary. Now we go to transport of gases. Now, once the oxygen has diffused into the blood, the oxygen has to be transported to the tissues. Carbon dioxide has to be transported from the tissues to the blood. Okay, so oxygen transport from the lungs to the tissues, and carbon dioxide transport from the tissues to the lungs. So how is oxygen and carbon dioxide transported in blood? Okay, how is it transported in blood? So now I'm going to go back to the whiteboard. Whatever I'm going to tell you is there in the PowerPoint slides, but I'm going to simplify it and talk to you about oxygen and carbon dioxide transport. Okay, so let's go back to the whiteboard. Stop and ask me if you have any questions at any time. Okay, share whiteboard. Continue. Continue. Okay, I need to get out of this. Okay, I need to get out. Okay, Okay, so let's look at oxygen transport first in blood. So diffusion is already done. Oxygen has diffused into the blood. So how is the oxygen going to get transported? Now, oxygen is transported in blood in two ways. Two ways. Dissolved in plasma, oxygen dissolved in plasma. And the second way is bound to hemoglobin. Bound to hemoglobin. And you all know this. You all know that the hemoglobin that is in the red blood cells binds oxygen. Okay? So oxygen is transported in two ways. As soon as the oxygen diffuses into the blood, it'll dissolve in the water. Okay, plasma is mainly water, so it'll dissolve in the water. And majority of the oxygen will get into the red blood cell. Okay, it'll enter into the red blood cell and it'll bind itself to hemoglobin. Okay, so that's the. Now, how much of the oxygen is dissolved in plasma? It's actually a fraction. Only 2% of oxygen, that is a very small fraction, dissolves in the plasma. 98% of the oxygen is bound to hemoglobin. So the major way in which oxygen is transported in blood to the tissues is binding to hemoglobin. And you all know that oxygen binds to the iron atom in the hemoglobin. Every hemoglobin molecule has 4 iron and one oxygen will bind to each of that 4. Okay, so we have learnt in blood. So this is bound to hemoglobin. Which part of hemoglobin? The iron. The iron in the heme. Only 2% is actually dissolved in the water or plasma. So this one is not very important. This is the one. The bound to hemoglobin is the one which is really important. And that's why if somebody is anemic, this will become less. This 98% will go down. Okay, because they don't have enough hemoglobin to bind oxygen. So the tissues will start suffering from hypoxia. Okay, so oxygen is only transported in two ways: dissolved in plasma and bound to hemoglobin. Okay, so if we were to put it as numbers, if I were to put this as numbers, in a normal healthy person, each 100 ml of blood has about 20 ml of oxygen. Okay, every 100 milliliters of your blood has 20 ml of oxygen. Out of that 20 ml, if I were to give you an idea about how much is dissolved in plasma and how much is bound to hemoglobin, so roughly about 19.8 ml of oxygen is bound to hemoglobin. Only about 0.2 ml of oxygen is dissolved in plasma. Just to give you an idea, don't worry about the numbers, okay? It's good to just know it, remember it, but I'm not going to be asking you how much of oxygen is actually there in every 100 ml of blood. But this is for you to get an idea that this dissolved in plasma is a very small percentage. Okay. The bound to iron in the hemoglobin is the most important one. But there is a significance to this dissolved portion. Okay. It has a specific importance. Okay. Uh, sure, Navira, no problem. So this does have an importance. What is this dissolved oxygen responsible for? The dissolved oxygen is responsible for the partial pressure of oxygen in blood. So that partial pressure that I told you, 100 millimeters of mercury, that pressure is only exerted by the dissolved part, not the bound part. The oxygen that binds to hemoglobin has no role to play in the partial pressure of oxygen. It is the one that is dissolved in the water of plasma. This is responsible for the partial pressure of oxygen in blood, about 100 millimeters of mercury. Okay. So that pressures that we learnt about, the partial pressure of oxygen in venous blood, the partial pressure of oxygen in the arterial blood, that is brought about, that pressure is exerted by the oxygen that is dissolved in the plasma, that 2% that is dissolved. Okay, so that is the partial pressure. The dissolved portion is responsible for the partial pressure of oxygen. Okay, so this is important to understand. This is important to understand. Okay, so oxygen is transported in two ways. 2% dissolved in the water of plasma, 98% bound to the iron in the heme portion of hemoglobin. But the 2% that is dissolved in the plasma is responsible for the partial pressure of oxygen in blood. Okay, so this is about oxygen transport. There's a little bit more which I will tell you once I share the PowerPoint slides. We'll go with that. So for now, let's go. I'm going to add another page, and we are going to look at carbon dioxide transport. Okay, CO2 transport. Carbon dioxide transport, remember, this is transported from the tissues back to the lung. Okay. Carbon dioxide transport occurs in three ways, not two, three ways. Okay, there's the difference. 7% dissolved in plasma. Dissolved in plasma. Now compare this to the 2%. Oxygen, I told you, 2%. Carbon dioxide, 7%. Again, remember Henry's law? Carbon dioxide can dissolve in water 20 times more than oxygen. So that's why the percentage is also high. 2% oxygen, 7% for carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide dissolves more in water. So that's why you have 7%. So 7% is dissolved in plasma. Next, 23%. 23% bound to the globin part of hemoglobin. So remember, oxygen binds to the iron in the heme part of hemoglobin, whereas carbon dioxide binds to the globin part, the globin chain of hemoglobin. Okay, and we actually talked about this when we did blood. Maybe you might have forgotten, so it should trigger your memory. So 23 plus 7 is 30%. 30% we have accounted for. We still have 70%. We still have 70%. 70% is transported, sorry for the writing, transported as 70% is transported as bicarbonate ions in plasma. Okay, so 7% is dissolved in plasma, 23% is bound to the globin part of hemoglobin, 70% is transported as bicarbonate ion. We'll come to this bicarbonate, what this is. Now again, just like the oxygen, this dissolved 7% that is dissolved in the plasma is responsible for the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in blood. So always remember, only the dissolved free gas is responsible for the partial pressure. Anything that is bound is not going to affect the partial pressure. Okay, so I hope I'm making that clear. I'm repeating it again and again. The partial pressure of oxygen and carbon dioxide, the values that you just learned, that value comes from the gas that is dissolved in plasma, not any of the other forms. Okay, so oxygen is transported in 2 ways, carbon dioxide is transported in 3 ways. 7% dissolved in plasma, 23% bound to the globin part of hemoglobin, and 70% transported as bicarbonate. Okay, now we have to see where this bicarbonate comes from. Okay, so let's do, there are pictures for you, but I'm just using this diagram just so that to explain to you, but we'll also go back to the pictures. Okay, now I'm going to draw a cell here. I'm going to draw 2 cells. We're going to draw a blood vessel. Blood is entering here, and here it leaves the tissues. Blood leaves. Okay, so let's draw, and this is the same picture that's there in your textbook. Let's draw a big red blood cell. Okay, what I've drawn here is a red blood cell, single red blood cell. So when the blood enters, oxygen is dissolved in the plasma. And then here you have hemoglobin to which oxygen is bound. So I'm putting a dot there. Okay, so that is called oxyhemoglobin. Oxyhemoglobin. Okay, now as blood enters the tissue, oxygen that is dissolved in the plasma will diffuse out, and it will diffuse into the cells. Oxygen that is bound to hemoglobin will also diffuse out and enter the cells. Okay, so oxygen diffuses out. I keep seeing people coming in, going out. I don't know why. Okay, so oxygen diffuses out. Why again? Because remember, the partial pressure of oxygen here is 100. Okay, whereas inside the tissues, it's only 40. So there is a partial pressure difference. So oxygen will diffuse out. Okay, oxygen will diffuse out. Now the cells have constantly been making ATP, so they are making carbon dioxide. So the cells have carbon dioxide which needs to be thrown out. Okay, so the partial pressure of carbon dioxide here in the cells is 45. In the blood, it is only 40. So this carbon dioxide, oxygen goes out, carbon dioxide comes in and dissolves in the plasma. It dissolves in the plasma. Okay, until the partial pressure of carbon dioxide also becomes 45, equilibrium. Okay, now next, carbon dioxide now, so 7% of the carbon dioxide will dissolve in the plasma. The remaining carbon dioxide, 23% will get into the red blood cell. So this is your red blood cell. It will get into the red blood cell and it will combine with hemoglobin. Okay, the globin portion of hemoglobin. So oxygen has already been gone. So carbon dioxide will diffuse in and attach itself to the globin portion of hemoglobin. And how much will this be? This is 23%. What do you call hemoglobin once carbon dioxide attaches to it? It is called carb amino hemoglobin. Carb amino hemoglobin. Oxyhemoglobin, carb amino hemoglobin. Okay, all of this is there in PowerPoints. So 23% gets attached to the globin portion of hemoglobin. Then 70% is still left. So the carbon dioxide that diffuses into the red blood cell combines with water. Okay, let me add another page and we will do that separately so that you're able to see it. So now we are talking about that 70% carbon dioxide which comes into the red blood cell, combines with water that is already there in the cytoplasm to form a substance called H2CO3. H2CO3. Okay. Carbon dioxide plus water gives this. What is this H2CO3? H2CO3 is nothing but carbonic acid. That's why I told you carbon dioxide is an acid. So when it mixes with water, you get this acid, carbonic acid. So your Pepsi and your Coke have a lot of carbonic acid. Okay, and the acid destroys the enamel of the teeth. Now, this H2CO3 is not a very strong acid. It's a weak acid. Okay, it can split. So inside the red blood cell, this H2CO3 splits into, it ionizes H plus and HCO3 minus. H plus and HCO3 minus. HCO3 minus is nothing but bicarbonate. This is bicarbonate. Bicarbonate ion. Why does this reaction happen inside the red blood cell? Because the red blood cell has an enzyme that can speed up this reaction. The enzyme is called carbonic anhydrase. Carbonic anhydrase. This is the enzyme. Red blood cell has plenty of this enzyme. So that's why the carbon dioxide, once it enters the red blood cell, the reaction occurs very quickly. Okay. And once it splits, H plus plus HCO3 minus, this bicarbonate ion will diffuse out into the plasma. It will get into the plasma. Okay. I'm so tired of letting people in so many times. HCO3 minus. So this goes out of the red blood cell into the plasma. Okay. And because the cell has lost a negatively charged particle, in order to take the place to maintain equilibrium, because this one negative particle is going out of the cell, chloride, Cl minus, will take its place inside. It'll come in. Okay. So as the red blood cell is passing through the tissues, oxygen is given off, carbon dioxide enters into the blood, 7% mixes with the water in the plasma, 23% gets into the red blood cell and binds to the globin portion of hemoglobin, 70% will combine with the water in the red blood cell to form carbonic acid, which immediately splits into H plus and HCO3 minus. And this HCO3 minus diffuses out of the red blood cell in exchange for chloride. And this will be transported to the lungs as bicarbonate. 70% of it will be transported. Okay. So this is how carbon dioxide transport takes place. Now, this equation is important to remember, not just here, but also when we do urinary system. This is an important equation. Carbon dioxide plus water gives carbonic acid, H2CO3. H2CO3 will immediately split into H plus and HCO3 minus. This is bicarbonate. Now, the beauty of this chemical reaction is that, and the enzyme that powers this reaction is carbonic anhydrase. Now, the beauty of this reaction is that it is a reversible reaction. So it can go this way. It can also go in the opposite direction. H plus HCO3 minus will give you H2CO3. H2CO3 will then split into CO2 and water. So it can go both ways. So in the tissues, when blood is flowing through the tissues and picking up carbon dioxide, the reaction goes towards the right in this direction. Okay, like this. This is in the tissues. In the lungs, when you want the carbon dioxide to be thrown out of your body, the reaction will happen in the opposite. It will go towards the left. That is H plus HCO3 minus will give you H2CO3, and it will split into carbon dioxide and water. Okay, so this I will show it to you in the picture so you'll be able to understand this better. Okay, let's take a look at that. Oops. Okay, what did I do? Okay, share. Continue. Let's go back to the screen. Now let's go to this. Okay. So let me show you. There is a little bit of oxygen transport that I have to talk about to you, but let's do this. So this is oxygen transport. So I told you 2% is dissolved in the water of plasma. So keep it as 2%. You don't have to remember the 0.5. Keep it as 2%. 98% is transported bound to hemoglobin in the red blood cell. And I also told you where the oxygen binds. The oxygen binds to the iron in the heme. Okay. Now, I'm going to skip a few slides. We're going to come back to it later. And then we will talk about that as well. Now, here you see the carbon dioxide transport. So 7% is dissolved in the plasma, 23% combined with the hemoglobin to form carbaminohemoglobin, and then bicarbonate ions. Okay, so you see, dissolved in the plasma is the one that is responsible for the partial pressure. Okay, don't please never forget that. Oxygen also, the one that is dissolved in plasma is the one responsible for the partial pressure. Now, in this picture, you can actually see how the carbon dioxide enters into the red blood cell. 23% binds to hemoglobin and it then becomes, it's called carbaminohemoglobin. And again, remember, it binds to the globin portion, the amino acids in the globin chain. That's why it's called carbaminohemoglobin. 70% is converted to carbonic acid. The carbonic acid dissociates to hydrogen ions and bicarbonate, and the bicarbonate is pushed out of the red blood cell into the plasma in exchange for chloride, and it is transported. Okay, so let's take a look at the next picture, which will be a little bit more. This is the one that I drew for you. Okay, exactly what I drew it, the same thing. Okay, so you can see here, as blood flows through the tissues, you can see that the carbon dioxide from the cells will enter the blood, dissolve in plasma. Some of the carbon dioxide will combine with hemoglobin, the 23%. The remaining carbon dioxide that enters the red blood cell will combine with water to form carbonic acid. Carbonic acid will split into H plus and HCO3. HCO3 will then come out of the red blood cell in exchange for chloride. in exchange for chloride to maintain the electrical balance. This is what happens every time as blood flows through the tissues. The moment blood reaches the lungs, okay, the opposite will happen. Carbon dioxide that is dissolved in the plasma will diffuse into the alveolus. In exchange for that, oxygen will come in. Okay. The carbon dioxide that is bound to the globin portion of hemoglobin will release itself and it will go into the alveolus. It will diffuse into the alveolus. In exchange for this carbon dioxide, oxygen that is coming in will bind to the heme portion, the iron of the hemoglobin. And the only main important thing here would be the bicarbonate that is in the plasma will diffuse into the red blood cell, combine with the hydrogen ions that are there inside the red blood cell to form H2CO3. H2CO3 will split into CO2 and water, and CO2 will diffuse out. Okay, so the entire reaction will happen in the opposite direction, in the lungs. In the lungs. So this is what, you know, may be a little confusing for you to follow unless you sort of, you have already read a little bit about it and today you go back, look at it again. This this is what you would have to do. Okay, so if even in the lab part, if you're not, you know, I might just review your respiratory system for you if you have any questions, because this is a cardiovascular and respiratory system are not easy. There are a lot of physiological concepts here, especially for some of you who are going to go into respiratory therapy. These are things which you need to know. I mean, this is the foundation. On this, you will be building a lot of knowledge. So it's important to understand how gases are transported, how gases diffuse. Okay, so I might take some of the lab time to go over this if you have questions. Kidney, we can always, I can always, next Monday, we can still do kidney. Okay, so that that's not an issue. We'll try and manage that. But this you have to understand. Okay, so this is how carbon dioxide is transported. So at the tissue, when the blood is flowing, when the blood is passing through the tissues, this is what happens. And when when blood enters the lungs, carbon dioxide needs to be released, needs to go out. So the opposite happens. Okay. So that is about carbon dioxide transport. Now, let's look at the oxygen, because there are some things I really don't want to go into too many details here, but you need to know a few things here. Okay. Now, we have talked about how oxygen is transported. 2% dissolved in plasma, water, 98% bound to hemoglobin. Out of this, the 2% is the one that is responsible for the partial pressure of oxygen in plasma. Okay. Now, when oxygen combines with hemoglobin, that happens at the lungs. Okay. This is called loading of oxygen. Loading, that is, the hemoglobin gets loaded with oxygen. It picks up oxygen. So the deoxyhemoglobin, the blood that is entering the alveolus, has very little oxygen. So in the lungs, oxygen diffuses into the blood, so the hemoglobin picks up the oxygen. We call this loading. Okay, deoxyhemoglobin getting converted to oxyhemoglobin. And you know that each hemoglobin molecule has 4 iron atoms. So oxygen binds to one iron atom, the second one, the third one, and then the fourth one, and all 4 of them. Once oxygen binds to all the 4 iron atoms in one hemoglobin, you say that the hemoglobin molecule is saturated. Okay, that means it's bound to oxygen. So when blood goes to the tissues, oxygen is given off to the tissues. Okay. Hemoglobin releases the oxygen to the tissues. That is known as unloading of oxygen. Unloading. The hemoglobin is unloading the oxygen to the tissues. So, by this, you can understand that the binding of oxygen to hemoglobin is not a strong chemical bond. It is kind of a reversible bond, it's a loose binding. Oxygen binds to the iron in the hemoglobin and then it easily releases it to the tissues as well. Okay, when blood flows through it. So, this is called loading and unloading of oxygen. It's not very difficult to understand, if you are trying to, like, let's say you're moving your home. So, you bring in a storage pod. You want to make sure that all your whatever you want to take to your new home. So, you load the container with whatever material you think you need, and then you throw out the rest. And once you drive your U-Haul or whatever container to your new home, you start unloading the stuff. So exactly the same principle. In the lungs, hemoglobin loads oxygen. It picks up the oxygen, and at the level of the tissues, it unloads the oxygen to the tissues. Now, what is it? This is where I'm going to make it as simple as possible. What is it that allows hemoglobin to load oxygen? That is, what is the single most important thing that allows hemoglobin to attach itself to oxygen? And that single most thing is the partial pressure of oxygen. The partial pressure of oxygen is the most important thing that controls how much oxygen will bind to hemoglobin. Okay, so the higher the partial pressure of oxygen, the more the hemoglobin gets loaded with oxygen. So you know that in the lungs, the partial pressure of oxygen in the alveolus is almost 104 millimeters of mercury. So it's very high. So oxygen diffuses into the blood and the hemoglobin picks up the oxygen and binds to it. So the single most important factor that determines how much oxygen is bound to hemoglobin is the partial pressure of oxygen. So the higher the partial pressure, the more oxygen is bound to hemoglobin. The lower the partial pressure, less oxygen is bound to hemoglobin. Is that something that is clear to you? Yes? Somebody say yes, no. One single.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Yes. Okay, good, good. Because in a Zoom class, I'm not able to see your faces, so I really don't know whether you're getting it or not. So, most important thing that allows, I mean, that affects the binding of oxygen to hemoglobin is the partial pressure of oxygen. Okay, so if the partial pressure of oxygen drops, okay, for example, if you're going mountain climbing, okay, if you're interested in climbing Mount Everest or Kinabalu or whatever, the Andes and all that, as you go up, the partial pressure of oxygen will drop. So the amount of oxygen that is bound to hemoglobin will be very less. And that's why the tissues will also have very little oxygen. And that's the reason why people suffer from mountain sickness. If you want to go up a mountain, ascend a mountain, you have to train for it. You just can't do it. Okay? Especially if it is a higher height, you have to train for it. So the training involves all these kinds of things, trying to be able to adapt to that low oxygen pressures. Okay. So that is the most important thing. So we can actually study this. We can actually look at how much oxygen gets bound to hemoglobin at each partial pressure. Okay. So at 100 millimeters of mercury, which is your normal partial pressure, we know that 98% of hemoglobin is bound to oxygen. Okay, so we can experimentally we can study how much oxygen binds to hemoglobin at each partial pressure. Okay. Now, that is what we call as the oxygen hemoglobin saturation curve or oxygen hemoglobin dissociation curve. Okay. This is what I told you. You can study it. You can actually plot a graph to see how much of hemoglobin is bound to oxygen at each partial pressure. Okay. If the partial pressure is 100, how much of hemoglobin is bound? If the partial pressure is 90, what happens? If the partial pressure is 70, how much hemoglobin is bound? Okay. So when you study that and make a graph, it is called the oxygen hemoglobin saturation curve or dissociation curve. Now here, now these are the details which I'm going to make it very simple for you. Okay. Try and understand this part. Hopefully, it won't be confusing. I'll just make it as simple as possible. As long as the partial pressure of oxygen is anywhere 80 to 100 millimeters of mercury, that is when you're breathing in, remember alveolar air, the partial pressure is 104 for oxygen. So even if it drops to 90 or 80, your hemoglobin is 98% saturated. That is 98% of hemoglobin is bound to oxygen. So a little bit of a drop in partial pressure of oxygen does not affect the binding of oxygen to hemoglobin. Say tomorrow you have, one of your family members has slight bronchitis or maybe even a lung infection, pneumonia. Okay, so they're not able to breathe properly. So their partial pressure, because their breathing is very shallow, they are not able to take in enough air. And let's say the partial pressure of oxygen in the alveolus, instead of the normal 100, it is only about 90. Okay. But they won't suffer from, their tissues will not suffer from hypoxia. Why? Because even at a partial pressure of 90, 98% of the hemoglobin is still saturated with the oxygen. So the tissues will get enough oxygen. That is what it means. Or tomorrow, if you go to you decide to go to one of the Rocky Mountains or skiing or something like that, because of the height, the partial pressure of oxygen may be slightly low. But that doesn't mean you're going to start having difficulty in breathing. Your tissues will not get enough oxygen, because as long as the partial pressure is anywhere above 70 millimeters of mercury, you'll be fine. Okay. The hemoglobin ensures that 98% of it binds to oxygen. So a slight decrease in the partial pressure of oxygen is not going to cause any major change. Okay. But the moment the partial pressure of oxygen starts to go below 70, you can see what happens. So the amount of hemoglobin that is bound to oxygen starts to drop. So look at the curve. The curve is going down. So at a partial pressure of 60, let's say 60, if you look at the line, only 90% of hemoglobin is saturated with oxygen. Instead of 98, only 90% is saturated with oxygen. And as you go down further, when the partial pressure goes to 40, only 75% of hemoglobin is saturated with oxygen. So what this means is, as blood flows through your tissues, the partial pressure of oxygen is only 40 in the tissues. So hemoglobin releases the oxygen to the tissues. Okay, so the lower the partial pressure of oxygen, more hemoglobin is released. The higher the partial pressure of oxygen, more oxygen is bound to hemoglobin. So at a partial pressure of 100 or 90 or 80, hemoglobin is 98% saturated. At about 70, if the partial pressure is 70, hemoglobin is probably 95% saturated. with oxygen. But the moment it goes to 60 millimeters of mercury, partial pressure of oxygen, 60 millimeters of mercury, it's only 90%. That is, only 90% of the hemoglobin is bound to oxygen. So remaining 8 or 10% is still free. There's no oxygen. Okay. So this is what it is. Now that you see these percentages, this is what is being measured by your pulse oximeter. Your pulse oximeter is measuring this, what you saw in the lab last time. All of you had 98, 99, 97. This is measuring this percentage. Okay, the percentage of hemoglobin bound to oxygen. So as long as your percentage is above 90, as long as it is above 90, you know that the partial pressure of oxygen in arterial blood is close to 100 millimeters of mercury. So it's an indirect way of finding out the partial pressure of oxygen in your blood. So the moment the pulse oximeter tells you that your saturation is, hemoglobin is 98% saturated, it tells you that your partial pressure of oxygen in blood is normal. It's 100. But the moment your pulse oximeter starts reading 90%, and if you remember the graph, 90% means the partial pressure of oxygen is only 60 millimeters of mercury. 60 millimeters. And this is worrisome. This is worrisome. 60 millimeters of mercury means the tissues do not get enough oxygen. Hypoxia. They will suffer from hypoxia. So that's why in the hospital, if the pulse oximeter is clipped on to a patient who's having a lung disease or a heart disease, the moment the this reading, this 97, no moment the pulse oximeter reading goes to 90%, it'll start beeping, okay, alerting the nurse that the partial pressure of oxygen is dropping. When it is 90%, the nurse knows that, oh, the partial pressure of oxygen is now no longer 100, it is only 60. So the tissues are going to be suffering from hypoxia. So even before, she informs the physician, she is going to start a nasal cannula. She's going to put a nasal cannula and start oxygen. She's going to start giving oxygen, supplemental oxygen, because otherwise the tissues will die. No oxygen, the tissues are going to die. But so after giving oxygen, the pulse oximeter reading will increase. Okay, so as long as the pulse oximeter reading is above 90%, the nurse is fine. She's going to say that, oh, the patient is doing well. But the moment it drops to 90 or lower, that means the first individual is suffering from hypoxia, because now indirectly you know that if this is 90%, that means the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood is only 60 millimeters of mercury. Instead of the normal 100 millimeters of mercury, it has dropped by 40 points. Okay. So this part is not so easy to understand. It is a little, you have to try and figure this out, in the sense that you have to read it a couple of times, maybe listen to the lectures again. Okay. But this picture here, shows you, okay, this is the oxygen hemoglobin saturation curve. Experimental, we do this, but it helps you to understand something really well. That is, as long as the partial pressure of oxygen in the air that you're breathing is above 80 millimeters of mercury, hemoglobin is 98% saturated. Or if the pulse oximeter reading is anywhere above 95, then you know that the partial pressure of oxygen in your arterial blood is above 80 millimeters of mercury. The tissues are not suffering from hypoxia. The moment your pulse oximeter reads 90% saturation, 90%, then it indirectly you know that the partial pressure of oxygen in blood has now dropped from the normal 100 to 60, which means that the person has to be given supplemental oxygen. So as partial pressure of oxygen decreases, hemoglobin releases more oxygen to the tissues. As partial pressure of oxygen increases, hemoglobin binds more oxygen. So in the lungs, hemoglobin binds oxygen. In the tissues, because the partial pressure of oxygen in the tissues is very low, hemoglobin releases the oxygen. So that's the principle for this. Okay. And when will hemoglobin release more oxygen to the tissues? Whenever there is physical activity. Any kind of physical activity, hemoglobin will release a lot of oxygen to the tissues. For example, when you're exercising. Okay, when you're exercising, you need all this during exercise. Or when you're having a fever and your metabolism is high, more oxygen is released to the tissues. Okay, so and whenever your tissues are working hard, they produce more carbon dioxide. So when partial pressure of carbon dioxide increases, when metabolic activity increases, more oxygen is released to the tissues. Okay. Whenever carbon dioxide is produced, carbon dioxide is acidic. So the pH of blood also becomes acidic. So increased acidity, increased carbon dioxide production, increased body temperature, and increased metabolic activity. When you are performing some activity, more oxygen needs to be released to the tissue. These are some intricate details about how the body adjusts the amount of oxygen that is released to the tissues. When you're resting, your tissues don't need that much of oxygen. But when you're working, whether it is mental activity or physical activity, more oxygen needs to be released to the respective tissues. What facilitates that is more activity means body temperature goes up. More carbon dioxide is being produced by the tissues that are working. The blood is becoming more acidic. So all of this causes more oxygen to be released from hemoglobin. The opposite will happen for binding. So when the partial pressure of carbon dioxide decreases, when blood pH becomes alkaline, when body temperature drops, when metabolic activity decreases, more oxygen is bound to hemoglobin. Okay, so this is about the transport of oxygen, and it this understanding this, how much of oxygen binds to the hemoglobin, is important for you to understand this principle. Okay, so always remember, pulse oximeter is not measuring the partial pressure of oxygen. It is measuring the percentage of hemoglobin bound to oxygen. Okay, it's measuring the percentage of hemoglobin bound to oxygen, or the saturation of hemoglobin. It's not measuring directly the partial pressure of oxygen. Please remember that. So if you look at the title tells you that pulse oximeter measures the percent saturation of hemoglobin, or if it's easier for you, percentage of hemoglobin bound to oxygen. That's a much better way of remembering it. It's much more easier. Please remember, it is not measuring the actual PO2. It's not measuring the PO2. Okay. So it's not measuring this value. It's not measuring this. Oops. It's not measuring this. It is measuring this one. Okay. So when it measures, when your pulse oximeter shows 97 or 98, indirectly you know that the partial pressure of oxygen in blood is 90 or 100 millimeters of mercury. The moment your pulse oximeter reads 90%, then you know that the partial pressure of oxygen in blood is only 60. And the tissues are going to suffer from hypoxia. Anything between 70 and 100, tissues are fine. You will not have too much of a problem. But the moment it becomes 60, from 100 it becomes 60, then it is going to create issues. Okay, so now it's already 2:05. Let's stop here. We will start at 2:30. Okay, we'll start the lab. There is a separate Zoom link for the lab. We'll start at 2:30. But at that time, I will go over any questions that you have on this. Think about it, questions. And then the last bit is regulation of respiration, control of respiration. Okay, which is also a part that requires a little bit of understanding. So I hope you're with me. So let's meet at 2:30. If you have questions, write it down so that you can ask me. Okay? So I'll see you at 2:30.